let me start by showing something, and I will show slides a bit later. I'm showing the book by Tom Nagel. It's a very interesting book because it has two versions of Thomas Nagel. It's his first book of any consequence, Mortal Questions. Very early on, not earlier in the book, he has this chapter on what it is like to be a bat, yes? But he views it, and this is clear from the introduction, as clearly introductory, propedeutical introduction of certain topics. Then he has a substantive chapter, the last one, much longer as well, subjective and objective, which is deep work. Moreover, it was followed up in his extremely successful book, The View from Nowhere. Now, the difference between what it is like to be a bat and the other works I mentioned is this. The first one is Humean. It is about qualia. It is about phenomena of what it is like to be a bat. And that influenced Chalmers, that influenced the whole discussion that we are having now within the framework of Hume, that with all weaknesses, Kant was able to combat pretty well. So why did Nagel abandon the subjective objective and the whole View from Nowhere, which was a very successful book? Because it relates to a very different paradigm. The paradigm that philosophers, not understanding Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre, especially, but also many points in Kant and many points in Husserl even, would have a very hard time grasping. In my publication from the conference a few years ago, I've been very delighted to be the first in the whole book talking about exactly about this. Today I'm going to talk very little, but I want to come back before I start my short slides to this big gap between the understanding of the subject as the subjectivity, as transcendental subject, but not in Kant's term, but in Fichte's terms. This is just this pure subjectivity. And you want, Kant also says that every notion should be examined and analyzed to the point it cannot be analyzed anymore. We will look for the purest subject as the onus of subjectivity. No, and then objectivity, and then how they interact. Those are sort of atomic subject and object. When we talk about that, we understand Thomas Metzinger's focus on pain of robots or something like that, because we know where it's coming from. It's not coming from just phenomenal qualia. So that was point number one. Point number two, to make it a little bit clearer, are my constant conversations with Ned Block. And I think I persuaded him finally that there was much to it. I think I actually, yes, there is the two understandings of phenomenal consciousness. And an article by Stan Franklin made it very clear to me. In the second issue of the newsletter on philosophy and computers that I edited at the time, Stan wrote a great article on phenomenality for robots. That was cool. It was completely following the vision that the dicto on paper Ned Block wrote. Just there was nothing about the first-person perspective as people who talk about non-reductive consciousness are talking about. It was about robots that can have all the perceptions and connections and reactions, and actually was focusing on, avoiding bumping visual perspective because that wouldn't be realistic. But philosophically, it was a perfect understanding of Block without his intention. So then phenomenal consciousness as Block intended, that's how I call it in some papers, is different. And yes, it requires this non-reductive consciousness that comes back to Husserl and others. we need to understand those things. So my presumption, I'm very optimistic about AI. I'm not with one of those experts who claim that AGI is not realistic, etc. So in principle, we can probably do all functionalities following continuous or non-continuous functions of activity in future robots. Yes. So this is something essential. The point is that that first-person consciousness may or may not be epiphenomenal, but definitely is not reducible to those functionalities. Okay. So the smarter we are about functionalities, the farther we get from the analysis. And I think now is the good time to move. I hope to cover the Church-Turing Lovers because they would be the next step I want to talk about now, but this is in my slides. Can you see me? In my slides? Are my slides visible now or not?
Yes, we can see you and your slides, but the slides are not in presentation mode yet.
You cannot see my slides?
Yeah, now we cannot see your slides anymore. We could see them before.
So they were visible and now they are
gone.
No longer visible. Okay, that's unpleasant. Hold on. All right, what do we do here? We don't really want. So there was a second where slides were visible and then they went away.
Now they are visible again,
okay,
but not full screen. And you probably want to make them in presentation mode.
Okay, presentation mode, full screen.
You can click
F5.
on the bottom bar on the presentation icon.
Yeah.
So this next to
F5.
Yes. Next to a little bit to the left of zoom out. The next button next to zoom out.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
Oops. Yes. Yes.
Right to the right.
Close. Yes.
This one.
Click.
Good. Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
All right.
You did
so
it.
Now you can see my. Okay. Sorry for. Luckily, my slides are pretty short. So the point is non-deductive physicalism, but very deflationary one. Defining machine consciousness is the second point. So let me move to this. Is it idiotic to make a computer enjoy strawberries and cream? Those who read Turing a few times know that this is from the famous paper for Alan Turing. Some of the robots can exhibit behaviors consistent with enjoyment of this spooky activity. Spooky because of, the obvious Mori effects. Says do not experience such enjoyment and therefore lacking the proper causal chain from enjoyment to its behavioral expression. But this is functional. So we can have robots that actually enjoy strawberries and cream and get some fuel from it or something and enjoy it kind of like, positive functions for robots. So it's not a functional question. Let me pause that this would be enough for a robot tasting strawberries and cream, but not enough to experience them to cool. Yes, so this is also a phenomenalist kind of language. But let's go to subject-object complementarity. Atomic subject and atomic object. This is what's in the paper from this anthology from 2019 that here I need to rush very fast because I could spend a few hours on this. The most reduced notion of the object is a potential object before it interacts with anything. Potential. Why potential? Because existence is an interaction. If an object is not an interaction of any kind, and it's not such that interacts naturally with the environment, then it's an abstraction that it's also potential in our head. The most reduced subject is a potential subject before it interacts with anything as well. The above are merely potential object and subject. Atomic interaction means that atomic object and atom subject interact only at the atomic level. They are not substances. Thus, there is no substance dualism. Those atomic things are just kind of concepts or products without enough ontological status to be substances. Interaction of atomic object and subject is the substance, always already both ontic and epistemic, both sides. Thus, classical German philosophy of subject and object, Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre in particular, is not idealistic but rationalistic anticipating philosophical relativity, but of course, not necessarily in the understanding of their creators, and definitely not for Kant. For Kant, that there was lots of idealism, I agree with that. So let's move a little bit to the second level. If we start with the notion of subject and object like that, it is natural to ask whether a human or a simpler animal is conscious despite performing some cognitive functions. For example, negotiating a curve during sleepwalking. And here is the question with Bernard Russell's, I think a part of what I wanted to write was cut. The problem of starting two perspectives. I see the same fact, whatever it is, from the subjective interaction as phenomena, and then I always have to add reality to those phenomena. My good example is Sylvia Plath's, poem, The Tulips. Somebody visits you in a hospital, you are barely aware of anything, and there are tulips. And you can ask yourself, is it your dream? Is it hallucination? Is it a hologram? Somebody made a prank, or are they physical tulips, okay? So there is always ontological interpretation of phenomena. You cannot get beyond it. And there is also a second aspect, an ontological, yes, when you see objects and then we ask how we can know about them or what colors they are, etc. That was Bertrand Russell's analysis of mind, but then everybody, including Bertrand Russell, accepted his understanding from analysis of matter a few years later, also in the 1920s. Okay? So let me use T.S. Eliot. There are two ways. Each way is necessary. It is also necessary to make a choice between them. Yes, cool, poetical, but is it necessary to make a choice between the objective perspective, realism of some kind, and subjective perspective, phenomenalism? Maybe we can use a complementary approach in which kind of like a, old interpretation of, quantum physics in terms of corpuscular and wave interpretation, still good enough for schools, etc. We can have not interacting aspects which cast the same object into different perspectives. So here are the Church-Turing Lovers. This defense of the need for that. The lack of the epistemic subject's primary interaction with the epistemic object results in the lack of consciousness to court. It may not affect complex conscious functions if viewed from outside. Thus, complexity of functionalities may not depend on first-person consciousness. That's kind of what I said before. But it may still be not epiphenomenal by the Church-Turing Lovers effect and IDO version of philosophical zombies. What is it? You can have, in principle, a future robot who is such a good lover or friend or whatever you want that he or she is indistinguishable from a human. At the level of granularity, you don't cut hopefully your lover, open to see whether the blood is there really or something, but at the right level of granularity. And you can go as far as you want. I have in my paper at OUP, this kind of conversation going very far into detail. We can have all kinds of specific situations. In all of them, a potential robot in more or less distant future could have that. But the question is, and that's the IDO effect, that's what makes it different from Chalmers' zombies. I have a business knowing and caring whether my lover feels something from the inside, because I do. And that's my answer to Kevin. I know we were talking about this many times, and we never persuade each other with much respect for each other. So this is one of those points. Why we care about about qualia is this first person perspective, and it doesn't have to be connected with smartness. That doesn't have to be connected with high functions, although those functions may, of course, increase first person consciousness between me and the roach in a way that is morally and otherwise relevant, of course. So non-reductive creature consciousness is what, Rosenthal, many people say is not even worth discussing in terms of independent consciousness. But I was saying philosophers are hunting high for new reductive consciousness when we should be hunting low as it gets, following Kant's methodological advice I quoted before. So, and here is a physicalist point. Not that the carbon-based chemistry is as physicalist as silicon-based chemistry or civil engineering. So if we go, this is the second complementary perspective also from the point of view of how to explain it. At one level, in a paper I wrote here, there's much explanation. We are talking about just kind of Fichtean or Husserlian pure subject and pure object and interaction that create ontology. But on the other hand, in terms of physics, we should be talking about the simplest level of consciousness that we can talk about, not the most complex. Okay? Ethical points. Not that the first person consciousness does not give frogs and probably roaches, probably because they sometimes are just not conscious, much of the moral standing. Yes, that was actually in a different way mentioned by Anil Seth, I think. First person consciousness seems like a necessary but insufficient condition for non-instrumental moral standing that may open some room for conversation with Professor Metzinger, but I'm not doing ethics in this particular presentation at all. So let's talk about a nurse waking a post-op patient who tells the family that he is conscious if the patient gives signs of consciousness, such as opening one's eye and looking with some level of understanding. Well, it doesn't matter if the patient is a human or a dog in this conversation. The reflection signs and nondescript noises do not count as indicators of consciousness, so they easily pass indicators of the patient's alive. We are talking about phenomena here. So this is where the level of consciousness we care about, not if we want to go down, at least as much, probably much, much lower, when this is also a yes and a no of something. It's, an impulse comes in, and since there is no comparison base, it is like yay, nay. So qualia are not necessarily yet there. That's where the consciousness begins. And the final slides. How is creature consciousness related to consciousness in AI or robotics? The subject-object relationship, belabored in classical German philosophy, especially Fichte and Husserl, provides a formal ontology for the existence of and role of the first-person awareness. On the other hand, physical explanation of creature consciousness explains how it is instantiated in nature. Okay, so there's the introduction to the last short sentence. They provide some background for the engineering thesis in machine consciousness, namely my thesis, from several years, presented in the International Journal of Machine Consciousness. First, that if we are materialists, we need to claim that also first-person consciousness can be engineered, whether it has to be built in silicon or in carbon-based substance. Many people underestimate that bioengineering today allows us to do not only biology, not only machines, which many bioengineers do, but also carbon-based chemical engineering, sort of using many aspects, of course, of cloning and things, but not going into biology in some cases. But this is a different topic. So the point is, we should be able to do it if this is possible, if we are materialists or naturalists of any kind. But I agree with Professor Metzinger that the question why is a much more pressing and much more important than one may think. Thank you very much.
Thank you too. do we have remarks from the audience or questions? Maybe I have a short question. Could you briefly explain what you mean by substance?
Substance, something that can exist in the world. That's why I said atomic subject, which can have just one relationship potentially. And I agree, this is my idealism kind of aspect. You know, the subjectivity is necessary for that to be present for something. So there is a context of experience, of potential experience that has to be there. Those are not substances, those atomic elements. Only when they are also at the simplest system of one interaction, yay or nay, then we can talk about substance. Otherwise, of course, one could think of metaphysics when atomic objects interact with themselves. That wouldn't be me, but that would still be a substance if this is possible. I agree, and that would be a deeper philosophical conversation, why this epistemicity is ontologically necessary. So the substance is the lowest ontologically possible for existence, not some kind of subsistence or potential existence thing.